Jeff Sickinga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center, and this is The American Idea, where we discuss the ideas, people, and events that have made America what it is today. We believe that by understanding our history and our principles, we can better live up to the promise of the American founding and preserve our ongoing experiment in self-government. Welcome to The American Idea. I want to welcome everyone to this episode of The American Idea. Today we're going to be talking about a place that we've all heard about, but I think we all probably know very little, or at least not enough, about this important place in American public life. And that place is what we now call Camp David, the President's Retreat. I'm joined for a conversation about this interesting and important topic in American history and public life by retired Rear Admiral Michael Giorgione. Mike was himself the commander of Camp David. I didn't know this until just speaking with Mike, that it's a Navy command. And so it's a naval officer who is always in command of Camp David. So we have someone who's been inside the modern American presidency, see how it operates and see how one of the most important places for presidents, Camp David, operates. It's a pleasure to be joined today by Mike. He's got a wonderful book out called Inside Camp David. I've had a chance to read it. Let me tell our listeners, I really highly encourage you to go out and get this book, Inside Camp David, filled with wonderful stories about the history of the place and some really interesting and fun anecdotes about the place itself and its relationship to the presidency. Rear Admiral Michael Giorgione, thanks for joining us on The American Idea.
Thank you, Jeff. Wonderful to be here. It was a wonderful introduction and summary, and hello to your listeners as well. Thank you for having me.
Mike, I think we think of Camp David as a modern thing, meaning in the last few decades, we see presidents leaving the White House and going to Camp David. But as you point out in the book, Camp David has a longer history. Take us back, if you don't mind, to the founding of what we now call Camp David.
Thank you, Jeff. We go back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's years in the White House in his use of the USS Potomac, called the Floating White House. It was one of the three presidential yachts over history. And Roosevelt liked getting out of the White House, out of the Oval Office, and going out to talk with people or pursue his hobbies or whatever. But it was the 40s, and there was concern about U-boat sightings and other aerial surveillance over the eastern coast of the United States. So he was told by his staff, sir, we really shouldn't use the yacht anymore. And he said, well, find me someplace I can go to get out of here, here meaning the White House. Coincidentally, U.S. Navy sailors piloted the USS Potomac. And so when they found this place called Camp Number 3, which was built during the New Deal era of the Work Projects Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, there was this public demonstration area, they called it recreational, in the Catoctin Mountains, which is now a national park. And he was shown those cabins. It's only 75 miles from the White House. And once he saw it, he said, this is it. This is it. This is my Shangri-La. And there we have the first name of what today is called Camp David, Shangri-La. He visited on July 5th, 1942. So since 42, it's really been the presidential retreat, first known as Shangri-La.
In those early years, what did Shangri-La look like?
Very rustic, very small cabins, very basic. During the Roosevelt times, he only went up in nice weather. He didn't winter over there, so it wasn't capable of heating and full staff accommodations. There are a couple small cabins still in the property that are preserved historically from that era. But since then, the aura of the cedar shake shingles and the oak plank siding and the same type of green paint that Roosevelt picked is what we use for the exterior architecture and maintenance of the camp. Certainly, it's been built out over the many years, 80 plus years, for modern accommodations. It's still very rustic, though. Looks very basic, very simple, but very nice inside. Very leafy, very up on a hill of 1,800 feet, very dark, and just as serene and peaceful as you would expect.
And was it known by the public that President Roosevelt was going to Shangri-La? Was that understood? And for example, was the press there, or was it really a secluded, almost hidden retreat?
I believe it was probably unknown of where he was going. We didn't have, quite the Secret Service detail in the way we move our presidents today as we do then as we do today. Certainly, they usually go by helicopter through HMX-1, the Marine Corps Helicopter Squadron, or by sedan if inclement weather. But it was probably very, very quiet, very low key, like a lot of things were. But over time, with the R of Camp David, especially since 1978 with President Carter and the Camp David Peace Accords, and the use of many presidents bringing world leaders there, it's become on the world map, and it's quite well known for that place to go to. And it's a very unique invitation. I find a president who brings a guest to Camp David would be, Jeff, like you bringing someone into your home, but into the family room, not the front room necessarily.
Yeah.
And the parallel there is the White House, very formal, appropriate, very nice, but there's something different about Camp David and the cabins you get to stay in.
So, of course, we call it Camp David now. Roosevelt called it Shangri-La.
Yeah.
How did it get the name Camp David?
So Shangri-La through the Roosevelt and Truman administrations. Truman really didn't care for Camp David. He went to Key West. That was the White House, the East Coast White House, if you call it. He preferred to go to the air station there. Eisenhower came in the office, really didn't care for it, was convinced to keep it. He had property up in Gettysburg, where his farm is today. But he said, I'll keep it, but I need to change the name. And so he changed it to Camp David, of course, named after his grandson, David Eisenhower. He also renamed the cabins. Roosevelt called the main cabin where the president stays the Bear's Den. He had very euphemistic names for somewhat of a sense of humor for the cabins. Eisenhower renamed it Aspen, which is the state tree of Colorado, where his wife, Mamie Dowd, is from. So there's a little bit of a parallel there in history, and all the cabins there today are named after trees. They don't have to be indigenous to the Catoctin Mountains, but an American or a world tree.
So Eisenhower, as you say, didn't necessarily care for it, at least at first, had it renamed. Did it become a regular part of his presidency? Or at what point in what presidency did it really become a regular thing? Oh, yeah, of course, presidents on weekends or at certain particular times, they'll retreat to Camp David.
I think Eisenhower discovered what it could be both personally and professionally. So he had the pitching green behind Aspen put in. He had, because he loved to golf. There's a couple
yeah,
photos.
Ike was famous for loving to golf, right?
Yes, and he had, I think, Robert Trent Jones designed that little 3-hole pitch and putt area. There are photos of him with Vice President Nixon at camp, and uniquely, Khrushchev, the first Soviet premier to visit the United States, was under Eisenhower's visit, and he took him to Camp David, and there's a couple neat photos of that happening in the 60s. So I think he was beginning to see it as a personal respite, a place to relax, as well as bringing world leaders there.
And then, of course, we get into the 1960s. We have the Kennedy administration. Obviously, the Kennedys are famous for being connected to Massachusetts and having place there. Did people like John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson, did those presidents use Camp David?
Kennedy with us a short time. He did bring macaroni, the pony. We did build a corral back then for them. And like many presidents, as you said, Jeff, they have other homes, but many have used both properties. The Kennedys went there often enough that the CEO then got to know them and their children. The children would play together. You see that very personable human touch at sometimes when you're there with the families, because the camp commander lives inside the camp. You're the only family inside the camp.
Okay.
200 yards from Aspen. And so you run into them on visit weekends and all the excitement, but it can also be a very lonely place for your family when no one's there. But the Kennedys used it a bit, and Johnson went there a bit after he assumed office. I think one of the most fascinating things in history is that Pulitzer Prize winning photo called Serious Steps, Jeff. And it's a photo of Kennedy and Eisenhower walking in the camp in 61 after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. And what I like talking about, and what you'll appreciate in your listeners, is here's the incumbent president, the Democrat, the young star, new to the nation, and he's asked the retired five-star general and former president to come to camp and say, "How do I fix this?" And to me, that was a great dose of humility and maybe a bit of desperation. How do I fix this and get back on track? And I thought that was a wonderful scene and a wonderful photo to see two presidents walking Camp David together.
Of course, your book also talks about the kind of, well, I'll call it the growing significance of Camp David in the 1970s. And you mentioned already one of the most important moments in American history that took place there, the Camp David Peace Accords. Tell us about the growing role of Camp David in the 1970s, maybe particularly in the Carter presidency.
I think that event, Jeff, definitely made Camp David more well known around the world. And people say the Camp David Peace Accords. Everyone knows what that means. Or the R of Camp David, frequently comes out of that time, where people recognize bringing then Anwar Sadat of Egypt, Menachem Begin of Israel together with the United States and spending a very painful and deliberate 2 weeks together, but in the end signing something. And I think that's been the trend to show how it can be used on the world stage and how presidents can bring world leaders there to kind of meet in a more relaxed, calm environment. And I think Carter demonstrated that very well.
In the late 70s, did Camp David, by the time that he brought, when you think about bringing two countries together that have been warring for so long, I always think, well, that must mean a lot of staff came with Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat. Must have been a lot of people around the camp at that time. Is that true? And if it is, did they stay at Camp David, or were they elsewhere and then had to come on to Camp David for discussions?
They stayed there. There are two principal guest cabins, Birch and Dogwood, and they're right next to Aspen. They're 45 degrees away from Aspen, and that's where the principals stayed, Sadat and Begin. And I know we're going to talk about my time, Jeff, but I'll make a reference to 2000 when President Clinton had his own peace summit in the summer of 2000. Similar setup, but a lot more preparation, a lot more security, I'm sure, a lot more involvement with the Department of State. And I look back into 78 and what they did to prepare, and we certainly did it a lot more efficiently, but there's a lot more people involved. So there's a lot more accommodations that had to be had.
President Reagan, of course, coming after President Carter, and we get to the 1980s. Reagan was obviously from California. He was famous for loving his ranch out in California. Was Reagan, and then after him, George H.W. Bush, were they frequenters of Camp David?
Absolutely. Reagan's visited the camp most out of any presidency, and he was there, of course, for 2 terms. He and Mrs. Reagan went there a lot by themselves, but they also had world leaders, Margaret Thatcher, Nakasone of Japan. But that was his place to get away, him and Nancy. It was just easy that way. And a lot of his radio addresses on Saturday were done from the back porch of Laurel, the entertainment cabin. And he just loved it. And he loved the crew. He loved mingling with the crew. His successor, George H.W. Bush, also loved, and his son, during my time, also loved Camp David and went almost every weekend. So it was a very high, what we call operations tempo, when the Reagans and Bushes were in office and going to camp a lot.
Yeah, so it does seem by the time we get to your time there, Camp David has achieved a kind of prominence in public life and awareness. And as you say, there's a rhythm to it where it's becoming more and more common in certain ways for presidents to be there and conduct major affairs of state there. Tell us about your time there. I think our listeners just be fascinated to hear what it entails. What are the challenges that you face running such an important place in American life?
Thank you. Very fortunate to have been selected for the position, and also very fortunate to serve 2 administrations. And so, we're there for the last year and a half of President Clinton, the election night thing, which we had a little wardroom get together to see who our next boss would be. And of course, that took 36 days or so. But just fascinating to serve 2 presidents and 2 administrations and be there during the transition. President Clinton used camp a lot more his last year in office out of the 08. He brought some guests there. He brought a lot of personal guests his last weekend. And as I said earlier, the 2000 Peace Summit. Fascinating to see Ehud Barak, Prime Minister of Israel, come to camp, Yasser Arafat come to camp. Similarly to Carter's experience, it almost fell apart. Clinton had to go to the G8 summit that was called then in Okinawa. He came back. Secretary Albright was in charge while he was gone. It went on for 2 weeks. Of course, nothing was signed. But my first takeaway, the biggest takeaway, was just watching a president manage the personalities, the issues, watching from the sidelines. And I know there's a lot more details, and there are many sources coming out today, even books and articles and opinions about what happened and what didn't happen. But to stand there and watch these world leaders come together as humans and talk about very complicated things was fascinating to me as a leader in understanding the power of the presidency and history. Similarly, when President Bush came to office, and I was there for 8 months, he had several world leaders. And what was most fascinating to me is he had the Blairs visit, Prime Minister and Cherie Blair of Great Britain visit, just a couple weeks after inauguration. Certainly he knew of camp from his father, because the Bushes always went to Camp David for Christmas. They always went there, not Kennebunkport. They always went to Camp David.
Ah, okay.
And he knew the place well. And but seeing him invite our number one ally, Great Britain, to the United States early and get to know them as couples because they had never met was fascinating to me about the power of having to build relationships early and get to know each other.
You obviously faced a lot of logistical challenges, operational challenges, when you have such a high profile people there. And while you're trying to maintain the kind of idyllic calm of the place, the kind of retreat character of the place, how do you manage those two or three competing interests and problems?
Excellent question, Jeff. And I always bring this up in my book talks, and I show the photos and all. I have a picture of a cabin called Holly. It's where Carter spent most of the time with Sadat and Begin. It's a smaller cabin. It's not the president's cabin. That's Aspen. But he chose that because it had a small little conference room that forced in more intimacy and personal conversations. I have this picture of Holly after a snowfall. It's perfect snowfall. It's beautiful. But I talk about, and in that photo, I have a caption it is perfect but natural. And that speaks to what you just asked.
Yeah.
Our sailors and Marines are all handpicked to serve at Camp David. Everyone has a background check. You get your clearance. All that goes into it. But we're still people. And you come there with very high standards expected of you. But to lead a crew like that and do it in a way that you're still reasonable and you're still approachable and you're still kind, but you can do the hard things if necessary, that was the greatest lesson for me in maintaining that calm, but that seriousness of what Camp David is, especially when we're hosting a visit. And so that was the greatest takeaway for me from leading people, was how to do it in a high profile, high risk, high reward environment, but keep it natural, keep it real. Okay.
Yeah. So that's a fascinating idea. You're looking for certain kinds of personnel, not just their technical abilities, which I'm sure they're very highly skilled in their particular area, but the kind of human being that you want on the grounds there. In part because there may be interactions with guests or, of course, with the president or his staff. What kind of people were you looking for?
Exactly right. It's not just your technical ability. And most of the enlisted Navy sailors are Seabees, construction men and women. That's the community I'm from. That's why we lead Camp David. 40% of the sailors are from the fleet rates, the Fleet Navy. And then we have the Marine Security Company that comes out of the 8th and I Barracks in Washington. Despite, yes, you have to have your technical skill, but camp is not a ship. It's not a Marine Corps ground. It's not a plane. And we all had to learn things we never learned, like structural firefighting and how to take care of cabins and cut the grass and all that. And it's fascinating. People are very motivated to do it. But when you do it day after day, there has to be a constant reminder to keep the morale up and people focused on the mission of why we're here. And, most sailors and Marines, of course, leave. We all leave eventually and go back to the fleet to do our expected jobs. But this is why the interview process is so important. We have to look for the right chemistry, the right personality, the right character of the person fitting in. We're bringing all the star athletes, for example, to Camp David, all the gold star athletes from the Olympics. And now you're all going to work together. Okay. I'm not complaining about that, but that's a unique challenge, right?
But it could be a lot of type A's.
Yes, a lot of type A's, Jeff. And And it can be a challenge because everyone wants to be number one and everyone wants to do a great job, and they're all here doing a great job. You're going to do well in your career. You're going to promote well. Everyone does. But, you still deal with people's nature and their own ego, and how to manage that was another great leadership challenge and lesson.
Before we continue with our discussion, I'd like to let you know about an outstanding set of programs that Ashbrook sponsors for high school students, the Ashbrook Academy.
Do you know any students with an interest in American history, politics, economics, and literature? Do they enjoy being academically challenged and the thrill of engaging with different ideas and viewpoints? Hi, I'm Sabrina Maristella, Student Programs Coordinator here at the Ashbrook Center. The Ashbrook Academy is a series of summer courses for rising high school juniors and seniors. Held in person at Ashland University, the Academy immerses you in the American story like you've never been before. Since 2015, our approach has taken history out of textbooks and into students' lives with historical documents and conversations about those documents. If you are a rising high school junior or senior, or if you know someone who is, we invite you to learn more about our courses and apply today at ashbrookacademy.org.
What about civilian staff? And civilian personnel? Where do they come into the mix at Camp David?
During my time, no civilian staff. It has changed a bit in that we now have a Fed Fire Department auxiliary now inside the camp. We had an agreement with the town of Thurmont, of course, like a lot of military installations do with their hosted community on firefighting. But I think we got smarter about how to do this more efficiently. And so we do have some federal firefighters, civilians there. Many of them are retired military, but they're still civilian. We have a couple billets, job positions that are civilianized, but 95% of the camp is still military. Okay.
Obviously, one of the things I'm sure our listeners are thinking about, and you may or may not be able to say too much about it, of course, which is the security of the installation. Obviously, it's a paramount concern, particularly as it's grown in its importance. It's saying whatever you can say about it. What are some of the challenges security-wise that you had to navigate?
I'll say the obvious. I say obvious, publicly known things. It's about 200 acres. It's in the Catoctin National Parks. We work with the National Park Service a lot on road closures and weather conditions when we have guests. There have been some humorous incidents over history about people walking up to the fence when it was not as well protected or defined as it is today. Certainly after 9/11, security protocols were enhanced and all. But it's it's a no-fly zone, a P-40 zone to aviators will know what, you don't fly over that area, just like the White House area. It's the most important thing. We have our Marine security company, and we certainly work with the Secret Service and FBI when the president is at camp, and other entities as necessary, depending on who's visiting. But incredibly secure, 24/7. The mission is always being able to ready to receive the president, and that's about the extent of what I can talk about.
Yeah, I understand. But that last part, ready to receive the president. I was thinking about that question. Normally, at least in the last 20, 30 years, it seems like the press knows well ahead of time when the president's going to retreat to Camp David. But there may be, I'm sure over the course of Camp David's history, there have been times when the president just sort of decides on the spur of the moment that he wants to go to Camp David. Did that ever happen to you?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And the best story, presidents are different. Some are very scripted. Some are a little more. And so I had two extremes. I had President Clinton, President Bush. And on the day of my incoming change of command, the day I'm going to take over as the new commander, we got word from the White House the president was coming that night.
Wow.
And normally, at least a week or two out. And typically during my time, you worked with the First Lady's social secretary, because that person is, coordinating who's coming, what do we want to do, and all that. He was coming that night. And I had been through a sample visit observing, so I kind of knew what goes on. But, now that you're in the seat, Jeff, you don't know anything.
Right.
And so the great lesson for me was we had the kickoff meeting. We had a reception. I had to push my family and my predecessors' families out of the camp. Everyone go home and get ready for this visit. And it forced me, with good humility, just to watch the staff prepare. All I had to do that night was put on my whites, walk down to the helicopter, salute the president, the first lady, the daughter, and all the guests, and off we go. And so that was unusual. Typically, we know a few weeks out. The Bush family, very scripted. We knew well ahead of time. And certainly, if you're getting a world leader, there's a lot more coordination with the Department of State, the White House, in the mess, the kitchen, and all that for preparations.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. That if it's a naval installation and you have very few civilian personnel, you have Navy personnel, Marines. I think our listeners would be fascinated to know things like, what do presidents eat and drink when they're at Camp David? What about special requests, dietary and other things? I'm sure all of that has to be accommodated.
It is, and we do our best to figure that out. And as you get to know the president, and most presidents come into office with a personal chef. And in the case of the Bushes, that personal chef would come up to camp a few early visits, but then he would teach our crew, our sailors, our cooks, what to do, and then we get comfortable with each other. We worked a lot with the White House and their kitchen staff and their bakery chef and their florists and their groundskeepers to learn how to take care of things. When you get into that personal aspect of what presidents like or don't like, it's important you learn that from the president, from their staff, from the first lady, social secretary, whoever can feed us information. And when you don't get it, sometimes you just have to guess. And it's particularly important, too, with international guests. When you have guests like the Middle East, when we had the Peace Summit, how to make the chapel seem more ecumenical by offering services, but also having a Torah there, and also having prayer rugs, and making sure all the alcohol is pulled out of the cabins for all the guests, and having kosher meals brought in for everyone, and trying to make it seem as equal as possible. If you got 4 cabins, you got 4 cabins. If you got 6 golf carts, you got 6 golf carts. And it's just this goal to be very equal and fair with all your guests, and to do whatever they need and to make their visit as pleasant as possible.
I'm thinking about the grounds that you were describing, and when you have visitors like that, I'm trying to cut my own lawn, keep up my own rose bushes and things like that. It's a big challenge, weather and soil and climate, landscaping there. What
Yes.
kind of challenges did you all face in maintaining the look of the place despite all 4 seasons?
Yeah. Deer were our biggest challenge.
Really?
There used to be a quote unquote herd of deer inside the fence line, and they would always eat the flowers. So we put up deer fences after we landscaped, and especially before a visit, you plant fresh flowers.
It's good to know that even presidents have that problem.
Yes, we had it for them. There are no deer today. The Park Service eventually removed all the deer. So now we have an influx of chipmunks, I hear. And so it's a different challenge. But you get those little microbursts up on that hill sometimes, and you'd have trees fall down. We never had any cabins damaged by trees falls, but it happened. Just maintaining that grass and the fish pond during my time was the biggest challenge, keeping things trimmed and fresh. And you mentioned the golf carts, as I did. A lot of people have never driven golf carts, and when you're giving a golf cart to a guest on these narrow asphalt roads, very nice. But it's raining and it's wet and they run off the road. They're tearing up the turf. And so, you and Jeff, you and I are out that weekend replanting the seed and sod. So
Okay.
It's a constant thing.
What kind of trees are there? Obviously, it's in the national forest, as you say. It's surrounded. But are there a particular kind of tree? And again, maybe this is a landscaping question, but do they pose particular challenges?
Other than the challenge as far as any dead branches or keeping them trimmed so they don't interfere with the look from Aspen's back porch into eastern Maryland or to east side of Maryland, tree rot, things like that. Oaks, maples, sycamores, red oaks, all indigenous trees, of course, in the park there is what we have, and the limestone rock formations underneath.
And when guests arrive, is there if a guest arrive and says, "Tell me about the natural history of this place," is that something that the staff have to learn to be able to say this kind of rock and this kind of tree and here's the formations and how do you handle those
Yeah,
kind of?
we train our petty officers to be tour guides, and that's
Tell us a
one of the
little bit about that.
benefits
That's
is
fascinating.
yeah, the president's bringing up his cabinet or bringing up a lot of elected officials from Congress, and our petty officers, that's their face time. They get to run the tour. So we train them more in the history of camp, but maybe some of those other interesting questions as you posed. I mentioned earlier the last weekend of President Clinton was 4 days. He had musical guests come up, and there were so many people there, even I had to give a tour. And
Wow.
I met several senators I would have never met otherwise, because you can't greet every guest that comes to camp, especially during a big weekend like that. But even I was pressed into service. But it's our sailors who learn how to give the tours. Yeah.
I'm sure there were, and in the book you do mention some just really terrific, heartwarming moments connected to Camp David, some funny stories, interesting. And I don't want to spoil all those for our listeners. I want to encourage them to go get the book, Inside Camp David. But, from your position, having to run the place and making it such a welcoming, accommodating, but of course, secure and effective and efficient place, what was, and maybe this is an unfair question, but what was the most surprising thing to you about being commander of Camp David?
Probably nothing really surprising, Jeff. This great crew. Things don't happen on their own. You still have to lead. You still have to do all the hard things. You do all the good things. You have to get to know your client, the president. What do they want to do and accommodate? You have to learn how to apologize. I had to apologize twice for things that didn't go quite right. Nothing terribly wrong. But, you have to be able to own things. So you learn that in leadership too, own the mistake. But the crew is just so motivated to do their job. And when you don't have many visits, it's tough. I can imagine over the years with many presidents who didn't visit very often. In fact, even during my time, I had a 5-month gap during Clinton's administration where there were no visits. And that's tough. When your mission, like you, Jeff, is to teach, and you don't get to teach for a long time, you kind of get a little itchy, and you fill the time with things that maybe aren't as efficient, but you find ways to maintain the morale, and that's tough. The crew wants to do their mission. It's important as we get to know presidents and sometimes the families, we remind each other that we're in their world, but we're not of their world. This is part of the humility.
Yeah, say a little bit more about that.
We're in their world, but not of their world. So, heartwarming moment when the Clintons flew away that last January night. And I walked them to the helicopter. The president and Senator-elect Clinton and Chelsea Clinton was there. And she turns to me and she hands me 2 stuffed animals. And she said, "Commander, I've had these in my bedroom at Aspen for 8 years. Can you please give them to your daughters? We have 2 daughters." That's heartwarming. This shows you that human element of people. Okay, so I'm in their world for this brief moment, but we're not pen pals. We don't write each other. Okay, so we're not of the world, and that's an important thing. I guess the surprising thing, nonetheless, is even presidents are human. And they like to take a nap and eat a cheeseburger and do nothing and recreate and bring guests and work hard. And, I do find it humorous when the press, anyone chastises a president for wherever he goes on any time of vacation, because you're never on vacation. You're always in touch. You're always being briefed. There's always things going on. And even at this relaxing place called Camp David, the presidents were always on. Something was always going on.
You can't name names, I know. And maybe you can't even relate a story, but I know our listeners would be fascinated to know, were there any guests, maybe not presidents, but were there guests who were difficult people?
There were a couple prickly moments with guest of guests. And
okay.
One time I had to have a young man removed from Shangri-La, that's the name of the bar, during one, big weekend. And that doesn't reflect on the president. I never saw it that way. But here's the guest of the guests who has lacked respect for his ability, his invitation to be there. And he was getting a little surly with one of our bartenders, a Navy sailor. And so I told the social secretary, I says, "I'm throwing him out of here." And so we grabbed him, and we didn't grab him, we escorted him out. And she knew what needed to be done, and he left. That's rare, Jeff, but again, you get that human element of people, and sometimes some people forget where they are, and they lose the respect for the camp and for the president.
Yeah,
that's unacceptable.
Right, of course. Yeah, wow. You mentioned these heartwarming moments. For you, what was the most rewarding thing to be that you had as commander of Camp David?
One of the most rewarding things is that today we are still friends with so many of the people we served with, and we still get together. They were wonderful supporters of the book. I mentioned just a few of them in the book, but I interviewed many of them. I put them in my thank you notes and acknowledgments. We're still friends with many people we served with. We all have wonderful memories of that. It's probably been the most fascinating, unique tour we had in our careers. I still get to go back to Camp David. I spoke at the 80th anniversary several years ago. That's wonderful to go back and see how the camp is being used and maintained. People reach out for interview prep if they're being slated to go for their interview. I appreciate that. I appreciate doing the book talks I do. I did one yesterday to a women's group here in San Diego about the history of Camp David with the slideshow. I just love sharing the history and the unique perspective of the presidents and how they've used Camp David. I'm also proud our family survived. It's a wonderful memory, but we still had two young girls, and there are many teary nights where they had no playmates. And one daughter asked me, "Why do we have to live here?" It did give them great material for their college essays. So, because no one
can imagine that.
You just don't fake that essay. Okay. So that worked, but they have wonderful memories, and they've been back a few times to see it as well. So all in all, anything hard worth doing there's a dividend down the road. So those are some of the things I'm most grateful, just like being on your podcast today and sharing it with your listeners.
I think I would be remiss before we go. I have a 13-year-old daughter who would be fascinated to know, and I'm sure many of our listeners would be fascinated to know, presidential families have pets. Maybe even guests bring pets, if it's permitted, I don't know. How about having to deal with pets?
Probably one of the best consolations to the girls living in camp was they got to meet the presidential dogs. So when the Clintons' black lab got loose one day and ran into our kitchen, the girls were just beside themselves with glee. I mean, it was just so much fun. And I have a great picture of our youngest daughter hugging Buddy in our front yard. Bush dogs, Barney, and I forget the other one, but those two first dogs, they would run and visit us as well. And Mrs. Bush would be all, apologetic. And we're saying, "What are you apologizing for? This is wonderful." So the girls got to meet the presidential dogs. No guests brought pets. We weren't allowed to have pets then. There's a great story about the goldfish. Tell your daughter to read the goldfish story in the book, please.
Yeah, that's right. It's a terrific one.
But she would. That helps make it fun. And when there's no visits, Jeff, it was a great place to have family and friends visit us and let them see the camp. They can't go everywhere like Aspen. They can't go in, but they see the camp. They see the nice playgrounds. And it's a fun place to hang out. Yes.
Fascinating. And I have to tell our listeners, it is a terrific book. It's full of great history, great anecdotes, great stories about this important place. Again, our guest is Mike Giorgione, retired Rear Admiral, commander of Camp David, and the book is Inside Camp David. I want to highly recommend it to our listeners. It is absolutely worth a read. Mike, thanks for taking the time to join us on The American Idea.
You're very welcome. Very welcome. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The American Idea. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to subscribe at Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a 5-star review. If you want to learn more or get involved in Ashbrook's vital work, visit our website, ashbrook.org.